The bomber climbed through 22,000 feet over the North Atlantic, carrying 2,700 gallons of high-octane fuel and 8 men who had been told this aircraft would bring them home. The temperature outside the fuselage had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Ice was forming on the wings, and somewhere in the dim space between the waist gunners, a fuel transfer line had begun to leak. The B-24 Liberator was supposed to be the future of American air power. It was faster than the B-17. It could fly farther, it could carry more bombs to more distant targets, and return without staging through forward bases that did not yet exist. On paper, it was everything the Army Air Forces needed to wage a global war across 2 oceans and 3 continents. What the paper did not show was the way the fuel vapors would settle in the bomb bay during long flights. It did not show the way the Davis wing, that elegant high-aspect ratio design that gave the Liberator its range, would fold under stress that the older, stubbier B-17 could absorb. It did not show what happened when a single 20-millimeter cannon shell found the right spot in a fuel cell that held more gasoline than most fighters carried in their entire airframe. The Liberator became the most produced heavy bomber in American history. Factories in San Diego, Fort Worth, Tulsa, and Willow Run pushed out more than 18,000 of them before the war ended. They flew in every theater. They closed the mid-Atlantic gap that German submarines had exploited to devastating effect. They struck oil refineries in Romania that the Reich could not defend and could not afford to lose. They ranged across the Pacific in distances that made European missions look like training flights. And they killed their crews at rates that the official histories would later struggle to explain. The danger did not always come from the enemy. The danger came from the machine itself. The Liberator was not a forgiving aircraft. It demanded constant attention, precise technique, and a kind of physical strength that exhausted men before they ever reached the target. Its controls were heavy. Its handling at low speed was treacherous. Its tolerance for battle damage was narrower than anyone wanted to admit. Crews called it names that did not appear in the recruitment posters. They called it the Flying Coffin. They called it the Banana Boat. They called it the crate the B-17 came in. They flew it anyway because they had no choice, and because the war needed what only the Liberator could provide. The strategic assumption behind the B-24 was simple and, for a time, persuasive. American planners believed that a well-armed bomber formation could defend itself in daylight, strike precision targets, and return with acceptable losses. The key was range. The key was payload. The key was putting enough aircraft over the target to overwhelm defenses and destroy what mattered. Consolidated Aircraft had delivered exactly what the specifications demanded. The Davis wing was a masterpiece of aerodynamic efficiency, its long, narrow profile generating lift with less drag than conventional designs. The twin vertical stabilizers gave the aircraft a distinctive silhouette and kept it stable at high speeds. The tricycle landing gear was modern and allowed for faster ground handling. The Pratt & Whitney engines were proven and powerful. What the designers could not know was how these features would interact with combat reality. The same wing that gave the Liberator its range also gave it a higher wing loading that demanded faster approach speeds and longer runways. The same fuel system that allowed 12-hour missions also created the potential for catastrophic fires. The same bomb bay design that could release ordnance in seconds also made the aircraft difficult to escape when the order came to bail out. The first combat groups to take the Liberator into battle were still learning its secrets when they began to die. In the early months of American heavy bomber operations, the losses followed patterns that seemed to make sense. Aircraft went down to fighters. Aircraft went down to flak. Aircraft went down because crews were inexperienced and the enemy was skilled. These were the expected costs of a strategic air campaign, and the planners had built their projections around them. But other losses did not fit the pattern. Aircraft disappeared on training flights. Aircraft crashed on takeoff with full bomb loads. Aircraft ditched in the water and sank before the crews could escape. Aircraft returned from missions with damage that would have been survivable in other types and found themselves unable to make emergency landings. The crew survival rate in water landings was worse than anyone wanted to discuss. The Liberator's high wing and deep fuselage made it top-heavy when it hit the water. It had a tendency to nose in and break apart. Even when it stayed intact, it sank faster than... The crews could deploy life rafts. Men who had survived everything the enemy could throw at them drowned within sight of rescue aircraft that arrived minutes too late. The official reports noted these losses in the passive voice. Crew failed to egress. Aircraft broke up on impact. Cause of accident undetermined. The language concealed what the survivors knew. The machine had turned on them. This should have ended the story. The problem was not that the Army Air Forces lacked heavy bombers before the B-24. The problem was that the bombers they had could not reach the places where the war needed to be fought. The B-17 Flying Fortress had become the symbol of American strategic air power, its rugged construction and defensive armament, the foundation of a doctrine that promised to make daylight precision bombing viable. It was a good aircraft. In some ways, it was an exceptional aircraft. But it could not close the Atlantic Gap, where German submarines hunted merchant convoys beyond the range of land-based patrol aircraft. It could not strike targets deep in the Mediterranean from bases in North Africa without staging through forward fields that were still being built. It could not reach across the vast distances of the Pacific where the war against Japan would have to be waged. Range was the constraint that shaped everything. Fuel capacity determined how far a bomber could fly, but fuel weight reduced how much ordnance it could carry. The equations were unforgiving. Every gallon of gasoline added to the tanks was a pound that could not be bombs. Every mile of range meant less margin for error on the return flight. The B-17's combat radius was adequate for attacks into Western Germany from bases in England. But the war was not limited to Western Germany. The ploesti oil refineries in Romania supplied a significant portion of the Reich's fuel. The submarine pens at Lorient and Bordeaux were beyond effective reach for sustained operations. The Japanese home islands were separated from potential bases by thousands of miles of open ocean. The solutions that worked in one theater failed in another. Fighter escorts could protect bomber formations over Europe, but there were no fighters with the range to accompany bombers across the Pacific. Naval aviation could strike targets near the coast, but carrier aircraft could not carry the bomb loads needed to destroy industrial facilities. Medium bombers could fill some gaps, but they lacked the range and altitude to survive against defended targets. The Liberator emerged from this matrix of constraints as an accidental answer to problems that had not been fully articulated when Consolidated Aircraft first drew its specifications. The company had been asked to build a bomber that could fly higher, faster, and farther than the B-17. They delivered exactly that. What no one anticipated was how desperately those capabilities would be needed, and how quickly the aircraft would be pressed into roles it was never designed to fill. The Navy saw the Liberator's range and recognized a solution to the submarine crisis. The mid-Atlantic Gap was a killing zone where U-boats operated with impunity because no aircraft could reach them. Patrol bombers could cover the approaches to the American coast and the waters around Britain, but the center of the Atlantic was sanctuary. Convoy escorts could only do so much against submarines that attacked on the surface at night and disappeared before dawn. The PB-4Y, the Navy's designation for its modified Liberator, began closing that gap in early 1943. The aircraft could remain on station for hours, searching for submarine periscopes and conning towers, forcing U-boats to stay submerged where their slow underwater speed made them ineffective. The psychological effect was as important as the kills. Submarine commanders who had operated with near impunity suddenly found themselves hunted in waters they had considered safe. The same range that made the Liberator effective over the Atlantic made it essential in the Mediterranean. From bases in Libya and later Italy, B-24 groups could reach targets that B-17s could not. The oil refineries and transportation networks that sustained German operations in southern Europe were suddenly vulnerable. The modification that made the difference was not a weapon or an engine upgrade. It was a matter of organization and tactics. The Liberator's range was useless without crews who knew how to use it, without maintenance systems that could keep the aircraft flying, without intelligence that identified targets worth the risk. The breakthrough came not from a single innovation, but from the accumulation of hard-won experience. Navigators learned to account for the winds at altitude that could add or subtract hundreds of miles from a mission. Engineers developed fuel management procedures that stretched the Liberator's range to its theoretical maximum. Crews discovered which systems could be trusted and which could fail without warning. For the first time, the crisis was under control. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. The success of the Liberator created a new kind of danger that no one had anticipated. The demand for crews outstripped the capacity of training programs to produce them. The demand for aircraft outstripped the ability of factories to build them with the careful attention to quality that peacetime production allowed. The result was a system that fed men and machines into combat before either was ready. Training for heavy bomber crews was supposed to follow a careful progression. Pilots would learn basic flight skills, then transition to multi-engine aircraft, then master the specific characteristics of their assigned type. Navigators would spend months learning celestial navigation, dead reckoning, and the use of radio aids. Bombardiers would practice on training ranges until they could place their ordnance within acceptable tolerances. Gunners would fire thousands of rounds at towed targets before ever facing an enemy fighter. The reality was compressed and compromised. Pilot training was shortened as losses in combat created demand for replacements. Navigators arrived in theater with minimal experience in the conditions they would actually face. Bombardiers had practiced on clear days with good visibility, not through the cloud cover and smoke that obscured European targets. Gunners had trained against targets that flew predictable patterns at moderate speeds. The Liberator itself required more from its crews than the training programs prepared them to give. Its controls were heavier than those of the B-17, requiring more physical effort to maneuver. Its stall characteristics were less forgiving, with a narrower margin between safe flight and loss of control. Its fuel system was more complex, with multiple tanks that had to be managed carefully to maintain proper balance and ensure that engines received fuel throughout the mission. Pilots who had mastered the B-17 sometimes struggled with the transition. The Liberator felt different in their hands. It responded differently to control inputs. It behaved differently in turbulence, in formation flying, in the critical moments of takeoff and landing. The instincts that had kept them alive in one aircraft could betray them in another. The rushed production that met the insatiable demand for aircraft introduced its own problems. Willow Run, the massive Ford facility in Michigan, was turning out Liberators at rates that seemed miraculous. But the workforce was new to aircraft manufacturing, and the pace left little time for the meticulous quality control that aviation demanded. Small defects that would have been caught in peacetime production slipped through. Systems that should have been tested thoroughly were checked quickly and cleared for delivery. The aircraft that reached operational units were not identical. A Liberator built in San Diego might handle differently than one built in Fort Worth or Willow Run. Crews had to learn the idiosyncrasies of their specific aircraft while simultaneously learning the basic skills of combat operations. The inside of a B-24 on a combat mission was a sensory assault that no training could fully prepare a man to endure. The noise was relentless, a constant roar from 4 engines that made normal conversation impossible. The cold at altitude penetrated every layer of clothing, numbing fingers and toes and making the simplest tasks exhausting. The oxygen masks that kept men conscious above 12,000 feet were uncomfortable and isolating, reducing communication to hand signals and interphone transmissions that were often garbled. A typical mission began hours before takeoff, with briefings that outlined targets, routes, expected opposition, and weather. Crews ate a breakfast that might be their last meal, checked their personal equipment, and made their way to the flight line where ground crews had been working through the night to prepare the aircraft. The pre-flight inspection was supposed to be thorough, but time, pressure, and fatigue often shortened it. Pilots walked around the aircraft looking for obvious damage or leaks. Engineers checked fluid levels and control surfaces. Gunners loaded ammunition and tested their weapons. Everyone climbed aboard and took their positions. Takeoff, with a full fuel and bomb load, was the first test. The Liberator was heavy and slow to accelerate. The engines had to develop maximum power while the pilots held the brakes, then released them and nursed the aircraft down the runway, watching the airspeed indicator climb toward the speed that would allow them to lift off. The critical moments came at the end of the runway when the aircraft was committed but not yet fully airborne. An engine failure at that point left no good options. Formation assembly was the next challenge. Dozens of aircraft had to find each other in the sky, often in conditions of limited visibility, and arrange themselves into the precise patterns that allowed their defensive guns to cover each other. The process could take an hour or more, burning fuel and exposing the formation to attack before it ever left friendly territory. The route to the target was planned to avoid the heaviest concentrations of enemy defenses, but the plans were based on intelligence that might be hours or days old. Flak batteries moved, fighter bases were activated or abandoned, the weather changed. What looked safe on a map could prove deadly in the air. The enemy wasn't the hardest part anymore. The German air defense system that had extracted such terrible tolls from American bomber formations began to collapse under pressures that had nothing to do with the aircraft flying against it. The fighter force that had once risen to intercept every major raid was being ground down by attrition it could not replace. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than new ones could be trained to the same standard. Fuel shortages limited the hours available for training and the sorties available for combat. The factories that produced fighters were themselves becoming targets, their production disrupted by the very bombers they were supposed to destroy. The Luftwaffe had been built around the assumption of a short war. Its pilot training program had been designed to produce a finite number of highly skilled aviators who would win quick victories and then defend the Reich against demoralized enemies. It had not been designed for a war of attrition against an industrial power that could replace its losses faster than it suffered them. By the middle of 1944, the pattern was becoming clear. German fighters still rose to meet the bomber formations, but in smaller numbers. The attacks were less coordinated, less persistent. Pilots who had once pressed their attacks to point-blank range now broke off earlier, preserving themselves for another day. The skill level of the average German pilot was declining as veterans were killed and replacements arrived with fewer and fewer hours of experience. The oil campaign accelerated this decline. American bombers struck at the synthetic fuel plants that were the Reich's only domestic source of aviation gasoline. Each successful raid reduced the fuel available for training. Each reduction in training produced pilots less capable of defending against the next raid. The cycle fed on itself. The introduction of long-range escort fighters completed the transformation. The P-51 Mustang could accompany bomber formations deep into Germany, engaging German fighters before they could reach the bombers. The hunters had become the hunted. German pilots who had once calculated their odds against defensive gun positions now had to contend with American fighters that were faster, better armed, and flown by pilots who had trained in conditions of fuel abundance. The threat that should have stopped the American air offensive arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to change the outcome. The Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was faster than anything the Americans could put in the sky. Its speed made it nearly impossible to intercept with conventional fighters. Its armament of 4 30mm cannons could destroy a heavy bomber with a single burst, but the jet engines were unreliable and consumed fuel at rates that the shrinking German fuel supply could not sustain. The pilots who flew the new aircraft needed extensive training on a type that handled nothing like the propeller-driven fighters they had mastered. The factories that produced the jets were bombed repeatedly. The airfields from which they operated were strafed by American fighters. The 262 appeared in combat too late, in numbers too small, to reverse the strategic balance. It remained a threat that American crews feared but rarely encountered. For most of the final year of the war, the skies over Germany grew progressively quieter. This should have made the missions safer. In some ways, it did. The probability of being shot down by a German fighter declined steadily through the last months of the war. The flak remained deadly, but even the anti-aircraft defenses were being degraded by shortages of ammunition and trained crews. What the declining opposition did not change was the fundamental nature of the Liberator itself. The aircraft that had killed crews with battle damage continued to kill crews without it. The systems that failed under stress continued to fail. The handling, characteristics that demanded constant vigilance, continued to demand them. The false sense of safety that came from quieter skies made the other dangers harder to see. Crews who had survived the worst of the air battle began to believe they had made it through. They relaxed procedures that had kept them alive. They took shortcuts that had seemed too risky when enemy fighters were a constant threat. That's when losses accelerated. The Liberator's vulnerabilities were not secrets. They were built into the aircraft's design, accepted as the price of the capabilities that made it essential to the war effort. But the full cost of those trade-offs did not become clear until the operational data accumulated. The Davis wing that gave the B-24 its superior range was a structural compromise that accepted lower torsional stiffness in exchange for aerodynamic efficiency. The wing could flex under load, which was normal for aircraft design, but the flexion that was acceptable in steady flight became dangerous under the asymmetric stresses of combat damage or control malfunctions. Reports from combat described wings that folded in flight, snapping upward at the point where the engines attached to the structure. The failure mode was catastrophic and instantaneous. One moment the aircraft was flying, the next it was tumbling earthward in pieces too small to allow escape. The fuel system that provided the Liberator's range was also its most persistent vulnerability. The aircraft carried its fuel in tanks located in the wings and in the bomb bay area, surrounding the crews with thousands of gallons of high-octane gasoline. The tanks were designed to be self-sealing, using layers of rubber that would expand when punctured to close the holes made by enemy fire. The self-sealing technology worked reasonably well against small-caliber weapons. A 50 caliber machine gun round passing through a tank would often be sealed by the rubber layers before significant fuel could escape. But larger caliber weapons, particularly the 20mm and 30mm cannons used by German fighters, created holes that overwhelmed the sealing capacity. And incendiary rounds could ignite fuel vapors that accumulated in the spaces around the tanks. The Liberator burned. This was the reputation that crews understood viscerally, even when official documents discussed it in clinical terms. A B-17 hit in the fuel tanks might leak and might burn. A B-24 hit in the same location seemed to explode. The difference in fire rates between the two aircraft types was a matter of operational record, though the exact figures were subject to interpretation. What was not subject to interpretation was the consequence. When a B-24 caught fire, the crew had seconds to escape. The flames spread through the fuselage with a speed that turned orderly bailout procedures into desperate scrambles for survival. Men who had practiced the steps many times found themselves fumbling with equipment that suddenly would not cooperate, struggling toward exits that were blocked by fire or jammed by structural damage. The most dangerous mission profiles were those that combined the Liberator's vulnerabilities with conditions that allowed no margin for error. Low-level attacks were the clearest example. The raid on Ploesti in August of 1943 became the defining illustration of what happened when the Liberator was pushed beyond its design envelope. The mission called for B-24s to approach the Romanian oil refineries at treetop level below the effective engagement range of the anti-aircraft guns that defended the complex. The aircraft would pop up at the last moment, release their bombs, and escape through the smoke. The concept was sound in theory. In practice, the low-level approach negated every advantage the Liberator possessed. The aircraft was designed for high-altitude operations where its speed and ceiling gave it protection. At low altitude, it was slow, unmaneuverable, and exposed to fire from every weapon the defenders could bring to bear. The defenses at Ploesti were prepared. Intelligence had failed to identify the full extent of the anti-aircraft positions. The approach was detected early. The careful timing of the attack plan fell apart as formations became separated and aircraft arrived over the target out of sequence. The losses were severe. Multiple aircraft were destroyed over the target or on the approach and egress routes. Many that returned were so badly damaged that they never flew again. The crews who survived spoke of flying through walls of fire, of aircraft exploding beside them, of friends disappearing in an instant. Ploesti became a legend, the worst day in the air for many of the units involved. But it was not unique. Other low-level missions, other heavily defended targets, produced similar outcomes on smaller scales. The pattern was consistent. When the Liberator was asked to operate in conditions that exposed its vulnerabilities, it paid the price. The statistic no one talked about in the official briefings was how many losses had nothing to do with enemy action. Training accidents, takeoff crashes, mid-air collisions during formation assembly, ditching failures, mechanical malfunctions that turned routine flights into fatal emergencies. Operational records suggest that a significant fraction of total Liberator losses occurred in circumstances where the enemy played no role. The exact proportion varied by theater, by time period, by the standards used to categorize losses. But the general pattern was documented across commands and campaigns. The aircraft was deadly to its crews in ways that could not be attributed to German fighters or Japanese anti-aircraft guns. The machine itself and the conditions under which it operated were responsible for deaths that the simple categories of combat loss could not capture. For the crews who survived being shot down, the war did not end when they hit the ground. It transformed into a different kind of ordeal that offered its own forms of death. The experience of a B-24 crew coming down over occupied Europe varied enormously, depending on circumstances that no one could predict or control. Parachuting into Germany was different from parachuting into France. Landing in a rural area was different from landing near a city that had just been bombed. Being captured by regular military forces was different from being captured by civilians or by the paramilitary organizations that enforced political control. The propaganda on both sides shaped what happened next. American airmen had been told that the Geneva Conventions would protect them as prisoners of war. They had been told that the Germans, whatever their other characteristics, observed certain rules of warfare when it came to captured military personnel. They had been told that capture would mean survival, even if it also meant imprisonment until the end of the war. The reality was more complicated. The German military did generally observe the conventions when it came to American air crews captured by regular forces and processed through proper channels. But the system had exceptions that could prove fatal. German civilians who had survived American bombing raids did not always observe the conventions. Airmen who came down near cities that had been struck sometimes faced mobs that wanted revenge for the destruction and death the raids had caused. The official policy was to turn captured airmen over to military authorities. The reality was that some were beaten, some were lynched, and some disappeared in circumstances that were never fully clarified. The SS and other political organizations had different attitudes toward captured airmen than the regular military. Orders existed that encouraged the mistreatment of terror flyers, a propaganda term that conflated all strategic bombing with deliberate targeting of civilians. Whether these orders were followed depended on local commanders and circumstances. Escape networks operated in occupied countries, organizations of resistance members who helped downed airmen evade capture and return to Allied territory. These networks were effective for some. Others were captured while trying to reach them, or betrayed by collaborators, or simply unable to make contact before German forces found them. The interrogation process that followed capture was designed to extract military intelligence from men who had been trained to give only their name, rank, and serial number. The methods varied from psychological manipulation to physical coercion. The Luftwaffe interrogation center at Oberursel had a reputation for skilled questioning that broke down resistance through isolation, fake documents, and planted information rather than direct violence. Other facilities were less subtle. The prisoner of war camps that held American airmen ranged from tolerable to deadly. The Stalag Luft camps administered by the Luftwaffe for captured airmen were generally better than the camps for enlisted ground troops. Food was inadequate, but sufficient for survival in most periods. Red Cross parcels supplemented the German rations when they arrived, which was not always reliable. Medical care was limited but available. The camps deteriorated as the war turned against Germany. Food became scarcer. Fuel for heating disappeared. The guards who administered the camps became more arbitrary as their own circumstances worsened. The forced marches that evacuated camps ahead of advancing Allied forces killed men who had survived years of captivity. The psychological toll was separate from the physical hardships. Men who had been trained for action spent months or years in enforced idleness. The uncertainty about whether they would ever be released, the guilt about comrades who had not survived, the not knowing what was happening to the war, to their families, to the world they had left behind. Even surviving the mission didn't mean safety. The Pacific Theater presented the Liberator with a different set of challenges that had nothing to do with the enemy and everything to do with the environment itself. The distances involved were an order of magnitude beyond anything in Europe. A mission from bases in the Mariana Islands to targets in Japan covered over 1,500 miles each way. A patrol flight from the Philippines searching for Japanese naval forces could last 14 hours or more. The Liberator's range, which had seemed so impressive in the Mediterranean, became merely adequate in the vastness of the Pacific. The geography created navigation problems that European crews rarely faced. Over Europe, there were landmarks, rivers, cities, coastlines. A crew that became disoriented could often find a recognizable feature and re-establish their position. The terrain, however hostile, was mapped and known. Over the Pacific there were only islands, and the islands were tiny specks in an ocean that stretched for thousands of miles. A navigation error of 1 degree, sustained over a long flight, could put an aircraft hundreds of miles from its intended destination. The difference between hitting a small coral atoll and missing it entirely was often a matter of a few minutes of heading error compounded over hours of flight. Celestial navigation was essential but demanding. Navigators had to take star shots through observation domes, calculate their position using sextants and almanacs, and account for the motion of the aircraft and the imprecision of their instruments. Cloud cover could make star shots impossible for hours at a time. The motion of the aircraft in turbulence made precise measurements difficult. Small errors accumulated. Radio navigation aids existed but were limited. The network of stations that covered Europe and the continental United States thinned to almost nothing over the Central Pacific. Crews relied on dead reckoning, calculating their position based on airspeed, heading, and wind estimates. The wind estimates were often wrong. The airspeeds could vary. The headings could drift. Weather over the Pacific was its own form of enemy. The tropical fronts that swept across the ocean could extend for hundreds of miles, walls of cloud and rain and turbulence that aircraft could not fly through, and sometimes could not fly around. The Liberator at high altitude could often top weather that grounded other aircraft, but the tropical systems sometimes extended to altitudes that no aircraft could exceed. Typhoons formed with limited warning, their development tracked by scattered weather stations that could not predict their movement with precision. A crew that took off in clear conditions could find themselves facing a storm system that had not existed when they were briefed. The search and rescue systems that saved crews in European waters were primitive or non-existent over much of the Pacific. In the waters around Britain, downed crews had a reasonable chance of being picked up by air-sea rescue services that had been developed over years of operations. In the Pacific, a crew that went down in the water might wait days for rescue or might never be found at all. Life rafts were carried in the aircraft and crews practiced deployment procedures, but the rafts were small and poorly provisioned. The sun was brutal. Sharks circled. Dehydration set in quickly. Men who survived the ditching often died waiting for rescue that never came. The enemy was a factor in the Pacific, but the Japanese air defenses never achieved the density or sophistication of the German system. American losses to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire were real, but represented a smaller fraction of total losses than in Europe. The environment itself was the primary killer. A 10-minute navigation error over the Pacific could mean the difference between landing safely and running out of fuel over empty ocean. A fuel calculation error could leave an aircraft short of its destination with no alternatives within range. A weather deviation that would have been routine in Europe could extend a Pacific mission beyond the point where return was possible. The weather that shaped Pacific operations reached its most destructive form in the conditions that no pilot could fight and no aircraft could survive. Tropical weather systems combined heat, moisture, and atmospheric instability in ways that produced phenomena rarely encountered in temperate latitudes. Convective cells could build to altitudes above 50,000 feet, far beyond the ceiling of any bomber. The updrafts and downdrafts within these cells exceeded the structural limits of aircraft that blundered into them. The turbulence alone could tear a bomber apart. Crews learned to read the clouds, to recognize the towering cumulonimbus formations that signaled danger. They learned to go around when possible, to climb above when the tops were within reach, to turn back when neither option was available. But the Pacific was vast, and the weather was everywhere, and sometimes there was no way around. Ice formed at altitudes where the temperature dropped below freezing, accumulating on wings and control surfaces in ways that changed the aircraft's performance and handling. The Liberator's wing, optimized for efficiency at normal conditions, became less efficient and more dangerous as ice accumulated. Desing equipment existed but was imperfect. Crews fought to maintain control while the aircraft grew heavier and less responsive. Engine failures occurred more frequently in the Pacific than in Europe. The combination of salt air, high temperatures, and extended operations degrading systems that had been designed for more moderate conditions. A single engine loss was manageable. 2 engines out on the same side was an emergency. 3 engines running was sometimes not enough to maintain altitude with a full load. The worst operational periods came when multiple factors combined. A mission that would have been routine in good weather became deadly when storms blocked the primary route. An aircraft that would have made it home with good engines was lost when one failed at the wrong moment. A crew that would have navigated accurately under clear skies became lost when clouds obscured their references. Records from Pacific bomber operations document periods when losses climbed for reasons that had nothing to do with Japanese resistance. Operational data from the final year of the war show weeks when more aircraft were lost to weather and mechanical failures than to enemy action. The exact numbers vary by command and by how losses were categorized, but the pattern was consistent. One representative period in the Marianas operations illustrates the phenomenon. Multiple aircraft failed to return from missions during a period when Japanese defenses were weak and disorganized. Investigation revealed that weather had played a role in most of the losses. Aircraft had encountered conditions beyond their ability to survive. Crews had become lost and run out of fuel. Search and rescue had failed to find survivors. The briefings before missions discussed enemy defenses in detail. They often gave less attention to the weather that would actually kill the crews. The assumption was that American pilots could handle American weather, that the skills developed in training would transfer to the operational environment. The assumption was wrong. The Pacific was not American weather. It was a different world, with different rules, and the Liberator's crews paid for the learning curve with their lives. The final months of the war should have been the safest period for American bomber crews. The enemy air forces were destroyed. The anti-aircraft defenses were depleted. The targets were unprotected. Victory was assured. The losses continued anyway. The attrition of the final phase took forms that the statistics did not capture well. An aircraft that crashed on landing was not a combat loss. A crew killed in a training accident was not a battle casualty. A flight that disappeared without trace was often attributed to weather or mechanical failure rather than enemy action. The accumulation of these losses created a pattern that survivors recognized, but official reports struggled to express. The dying had not stopped. It had only changed its character. Fatigue was a factor that compounded every other risk. Crews who had flown dozens of missions operated with a kind of exhausted efficiency that left no margin for error. The reflexes that had kept them alive were slower. The attention that had caught small problems before they became large ones was degraded. The will to survive that had driven them through the worst of the air battle was worn down. The maintenance systems that supported the bomber force were themselves showing strain. Ground crews worked long hours with inadequate rest, servicing aircraft that came back damaged and sending them out again on compressed schedules. Parts shortages meant that some repairs were deferred, some systems were not replaced. Some aircraft flew with deficiencies that would have grounded them in peacetime. The urgency of victory created pressure to fly missions that would not have been approved in earlier phases of the war. Targets that were marginal became acceptable. Weather limits that would have canceled operations were relaxed. The calculation that balanced mission value against crew risk shifted as the end came into view. New crews continued to arrive from the training pipeline, their inexperience a liability in operational conditions they barely understood. The veterans who should have mentored them were rotating home or already gone. The institutional knowledge that kept crews alive was dispersing even as the missions continued. Aircraft that had survived months of operations developed the accumulated wear that time and stress produced. Engines that had been reliable began to show symptoms. Control systems that had functioned perfectly developed play and looseness. Hydraulic lines that had held pressure began to leak. The production miracle that had built 18,000 Liberators had not produced 18,000 identical aircraft. The machines that remained in service in the final months were a mixed fleet of various modifications, various production lots, various maintenance histories. Some were nearly new. Others had absorbed damage and repair through dozens of missions. Each aircraft had its own personality, its own quirks, its own failure modes waiting to manifest. The crews who flew these aircraft developed relationships with them that combined trust and suspicion. They knew which systems to watch. They knew which warning signs to heed. They knew when their aircraft was flying well and when something was wrong. But the knowing was imperfect, and the machines could fail in ways that even experienced crews could not anticipate. The war was ending. The dying wasn't. In the final weeks of the Pacific War, a B-24 crew prepared for a mission that was supposed to be routine. The target was a supply depot that intelligence indicated was lightly defended. The weather forecast was acceptable. The aircraft had been serviced and cleared for flight. The crew had been together for months, long enough to develop the coordination that kept heavy bombers flying. The pilot had learned the Liberator's characteristics through experience that no training program could replicate. The co-pilot had grown from a nervous newcomer into a reliable backup who could take over if needed. The navigator had developed the intuition that Pacific operations demanded, the ability to find small islands in vast oceans using instruments that were imprecise and conditions that were changeable. The flight engineer knew the aircraft's systems better than any manual could describe. The radio operator had learned to coax communication from equipment that was temperamental and often inadequate. The gunners had spent months watching empty skies for threats that rarely materialized but could never be dismissed. They had lost friends to the war. They had seen aircraft go down and crews disappear. They understood what their numbers meant, how many crews did not complete their tours, how narrow the margin was between survival and death. They believed, with the irrational confidence that sustained all combat crews, that they would be among the survivors. The mission began normally. Takeoff was uneventful. The climb to altitude proceeded as expected. The weather was better than forecast, the clouds broken rather than solid, the visibility adequate for navigation. The formation assembled without incident. The route to the target took them over water that stretched to every horizon, the Pacific's emptiness reinforced by the knowledge that any emergency would leave them far from help. The fuel calculations had been checked and rechecked. The aircraft was performing within parameters. Nothing indicated that this mission would be different from the others. Accounts of what happened next are incomplete. The aircraft developed a problem that was not immediately catastrophic, but could not be ignored. The nature of the malfunction varied in different tellings, but the pattern was familiar. A system that should have worked did not. A procedure that should have resolved the issue failed. A decision that should have been straightforward became complicated by factors that no one had anticipated. The crew faced choices that combat training had not prepared them to make. Turn back and abort the mission? Continue and hope the problem stabilized? Divert to an alternate base that was farther than they wanted to fly with a questionable aircraft? The decision they made was reasonable, given what they knew at the time. It became the wrong decision only later, when the situation deteriorated in ways they could not have predicted. The margin they thought they had disappeared. The options they thought they retained closed off one by one. The final moments of the flight are not documented in detail. What is known is that the aircraft did not return. Search missions found nothing. The crew was listed as missing, then as presumed dead. Their families received telegrams that contained no bodies to bury and no certainty about what had happened. They were not the first crew lost in circumstances that combined mechanical failure with operational pressure with the unforgiving mathematics of Pacific distances. They were not the last. They were representative of a pattern that repeated itself through the final months of the war, young men disappearing into an ocean that kept its secrets. The announcement of Japan's surrender came while aircraft were still being serviced for missions that would never fly. Ground crews who had been loading bombs received orders to stop. Flight schedules that had been posted were canceled. The machinery of war wound down with a suddenness that left men disoriented. The crews who had survived learned the news through official channels and through the celebrations that erupted across bases throughout the Pacific. After years of war, after friends lost and missions endured, the fighting was over. They had made it. The reckoning of who had not made it came more slowly. Official records had to be compiled. Missing aircraft had to be investigated. Families had to be notified. The bureaucracy of casualty reporting ground forward even as the war itself ended. For some families, the notification arrived after the victory celebrations had already begun. The war was over, and their sons and brothers and husbands had not survived to see it. The telegrams that delivered the news made no distinction between combat losses and operational accidents. Dead was dead. Missing was missing. The crew that had disappeared on what should have been a routine mission in the final weeks of the war was among those whose fate remained uncertain. They were listed as missing in action, their aircraft never found, their remains never recovered. The ocean that had swallowed them kept their secret. In the years after the war, families petitioned for information that the military could not provide. They sought closure that the records could not deliver. Some held out hope that their loved ones might have survived, might have been taken prisoner, might somehow reappear now that the fighting was done. The hope faded slowly. The prisoners came home, and the missing did not reappear. The records were examined and re-examined, and the verdicts remained the same. Presumed dead. No recovery, no grave to visit. The Liberator had taken them, not the enemy. The machine that had carried them to war had become the instrument of their deaths. The irony was lost on the official reports, which categorized and quantified and moved on. For the families, the irony was a wound that never fully healed. The B-24 Liberator became a museum piece, preserved in the temples of aviation history where visitors could walk beneath its wings and imagine what it had been like to fly. The survivors aged and gathered for reunions where the membership thinned each year. The aircraft's reputation settled into a kind of official memory that emphasized its contributions to victory. It had closed the Atlantic Gap. It had destroyed the Romanian oil refineries. It had ranged across the Pacific in distances that defined the meaning of strategic reach. It had been the most produced heavy bomber in history, a symbol of American industrial might, turned to the purpose of winning the war. The memorial services and the monument dedications spoke of sacrifice and courage and the debt that freedom owed to those who had served. The speeches praised the aircraft and the men who flew it. The ceremonies were dignified and appropriate and incomplete. The survivors knew what the ceremonies could not capture. They knew what the Liberator had demanded from them and what it had taken. They knew colleagues who had died not in the flak-torn skies over Germany or the shark-haunted waters of the Pacific, but in training accidents and mechanical failures and operational mishaps that the clean categories of wartime service could not contain. They knew the morning briefings where weather reports predicted conditions that proved deadly. They knew the aircraft that should have worked and did not. They knew the missions that should have been canceled and were not. They knew the decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and proved fatal in the outcome. Some of them never spoke of it. The war was won. The dead were honored. What was the point of dwelling on the ways the machine had betrayed them? Better to remember the victories, the missions completed, the targets destroyed. Better to take pride in what had been accomplished and leave the rest to silence. Others could not forget. They carried the knowledge, like a weight that did not diminish with time. The faces of friends who had not returned, the sounds of aircraft that had not come back, the uncertainty about what had happened and why, the conviction that what they had survived was not just the enemy, but the aircraft itself. The Liberator flies today in air shows, a handful of restored aircraft maintained by organizations dedicated to preserving aviation heritage. The crowds watch it pass overhead and see a symbol of the greatest generation, an artifact of the war that defined the century. They see victory. When people talk about this aircraft, they talk about success. They talk about range and payload and strategic impact. They talk about the missions that won the war. But for the people who flew it, success was surviving what came after.